Hi folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new symphonic metal album from Tarja Turunen, titled Colors in the Dark. It's really hard to talk about Tarja Turunen without talking about, in some way, Nightwish. Yeah, even her solo career. Now I should explain for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, and it's going to require a bit of a history lesson. Back in 1996, there was a keyboardist, an insanely talented songwriter in Finland named Tuomas Holopainen, and he recruited guitarist Empu Vuorinen and classical singer Tarja Turunen to form a band that would fuse classical symphonic music with heavy metal. In 1997, they released their first album, birthing a whole new genre of metal, symphonic metal, that would take them to fame and fortune. Now, it was also one of the first genres of metal that I ever discovered, and Nightwish was one of the first bands that I found that I really liked, which was in large part thanks to Tarja Turunen's soaring, powerful, operatic vocals. To put it another way, Nightwish is one of the few bands who actually cover Phantom of the Opera and actually managed to match Sarah Brightman's incredible delivery. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, Nightwish made a ton of fantastic music that I still love to this day. And then in 2005, Tarja Turunen was fired from the band through an open letter by Tuomas, and the band split violently in two, and so did the fan base. Now, as somebody with the benefit of context and hindsight, I can say that there was no party involved in this split that is completely innocent or deserves all the blame. Tuomas was always a brilliant, introverted control freak who couldn't stand not getting his own way, and Tarja got used to being the face of the band and thus became a bit of a diva. But as Tarja swore that she was going to keep on making music on her own, so the same year Nightwish released their comeback album, Dark Passion Play, with new vocalist Annette Olsen, Tarja also released her solo album, My Winter Storm. One thing was for sure on both these albums: neither Tarja or Tuomas, as the songwriter, were completely over the whole breakup thing, and were taking more than their fair share of complicated emotions regarding the whole affair. However, the important question regarding that album from Tarja tends to get overlooked amid all the hysterics and all the fan base bitching, and I'm here to provide an answer to that question. Is Tarja's solo material actually any good? Well, to be blunt, it's better than I expected. Considering it was Tarja's first attempt to write songs on her own, I was surprised how many of the songs came together. And Tarja's voice is still as strong and gorgeous as ever, and she's always had a lot of personality and energy in her delivery. The problem becomes that this album is automatically going to be compared with Dark Passion Play, one of the best albums Nightwish ever made that still holds up to this day. Nightwish made a classic album of the symphonic metal genre, and My Winter Storm, as good of an album as it is, and it is good, just can't compete with that on songwriting or instrumentation. Fortunately, her follow-up, What Lies Beneath, was actually a fair bit better, actually showing that Tarja Turunen's songwriting was only getting better, and that she was experimenting with different symphonic metal sounds and styles, proving that she could indeed be a pretty potent solo act. Yeah, not all the experimentation worked. The hints of more industrial sounds were especially hit and miss. They didn't exactly fuse well with the classical instrumentation, and some of the tempo changes mid-song brought mixed results, but it was enough to give me a bit of hope that her newest album this year could actually be something somewhat special. So, with all that in mind, what do I think of Tarja Turunen's newest album, Colors in the Dark? Well, I'm happy to say that it's not just a great album, it might just be her best album yet. It's an album that is not only proves that Tarja Turunen could be a powerful solo artist, but that she might actually be able to compete with Nightwish all by herself. And while I'm not sure it'll make my list of the best albums of the year, it's a real treasure to see Tarja make real improvements all across the board. Now first, the obvious positives. Tarja's voice is as great as ever, with the classical training and impressive range that made her and Nightwish the powerhouse they were for several years. But what surprised me here was that Tarja sounds more deeply emotionally invested in her material than I think she ever has. One of my underlying issues with Tarja Turunen, particularly when she was with Nightwish, you see, was that despite her incredible voice and incredible range, I always felt a distinctive distance, that she felt a bit removed from her material. Sure, her voice often conveyed the requisite emotions, but too often it felt a bit like she wasn't quite engaged with the actual material in the way that showed that she really felt it. It's an issue I tend to find with most classical opera, at least in my experience. They may have incredible technical skills, but that emotional connection can be missing at points. And yet, this album really struck me with how much Tarja seemed to genuinely care about the songs that she was singing. Maybe it was because she played a more sizable role in writing said songs, but it definitely shows that she was working a lot harder to show more vulnerability and sell the quieter emotions in her music, and it does wonders for her likability on the tracks. Now, it helps significantly that the instrumentation has been significantly tightened up on this album. There's still a few snags here and there in terms of tempo changes and some awkward transitions which weaken a few of the tracks on the album, but Tarja's blend of classical symphonic metal and harsher, more industrial touches is a lot cleaner than it was on previous albums, mostly because the transitions between the harsher, grinding guitars is balanced out by smoother, classier electronica elements that fit together a lot better. I will say that I think the drums sound a bit too triggered and inorganic than I would typically prefer, but it's not a deal breaker, and I was more than a little surprised by how seamless the classical industrial sounds were blended. And it's not just the instrumentation that's shown improvement here either, which takes us to the songwriting. Yes, there are still a few hiccups here and there that show Tarja is still learning how to frame together good lyrics, but for the most part there is a surprising amount of coherent and well-executed poetry here, with a certain degree of class and flair that still manages to reveal vulnerability. More often than not, Tarja is willing to insert herself as the protagonist/antagonist of the song, which shows a commitment to framing the songs in a distinctly interesting and artistically compelling light. In this particular case, the title of the album, Colors in the Dark, is indicative of the album's content, a series of songs that attempt to examine the various shades of gray in which certain villains or dark situations might exist, from victims of ritual, which frames the victim as the cult leader for falling into darkness instead of the actual sacrifice victim, to 500 Letters, which describes an obsessive relationship gone wrong in the worst possible way, to even the doomed love song duet Medusa. Every song is written to show some fragment of depth into potentially one-dimensional situations of villainy. Now, to be blunt, this sort of subject matter isn't precisely revolutionary, and Tarja's not exactly pushing boundaries by showing obvious cases of moral ambiguity and some obvious questions that could be raised in these situations. Furthermore, there isn't really much of an arc to this album, just a series of unconnected incidents that are strung together on a loose theme that lacks a real climax. And there's a real problem with flow on this album. It doesn't really flow together coherently and cohesively as an album whole. But when I feel Tarja's songwriting lacks in that serious depth, she makes up with in presentation and delivery. It does require a certain amount of creativity to be able to frame her own scenes and cast herself as either the protagonist or the antagonist, which does render the album a bit more complex than many would give it credit. And on that note, I can't help but say that I was rather pleased that Tarja was willing to continue to throw herself into lyrics steeped with fantasy-inspired imagery and poetry, and that she was willing to write said lyrics shows that she has a real passion for the genre. It did a lot to dispel the myth that had long persisted in my mind that Tarja thought herself above that sort of fantastical material, and to be honest, I was thrilled to be proven wrong. So, with all that in mind, I can definitely recommend Tarja Turunen's Colors in the Dark. Yes, the album is more of a collection of songs and a collection of singles than a truly coherent album, but those songs are often incredibly solid on their merits alone. If you are looking for definite proof that Tarja could stand on her own without Nightwish with an entirely unique style and sensibility, this is the album for which you've been waiting. Because in terms of instrumentation, delivery, and songwriting, this is her best album yet. In other words, if Within Temptation was looking for serious competition this year in the symphonic metal scene, they've got it now. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I've got more videos coming up on the way. It's going to be a busy September for me. Particularly starting off coming up soon, 9 Inch Nails. See you next time.